You're probably already familiar with stories of American bomber crews who flew through hell over Germany, facing impossible odds and somehow making it home. You've likely heard about the courage it took to climb into a B-17 flying fortress every morning knowing the statistics were against you. But chances are you're less familiar with the fighter pilots who escorted those bombers, and even less familiar with the one pilot who, on a frozen January day in 1944, did something that should have been impossible. To be absolutely clear, this is not a story about how many enemy aircraft one pilot shot down. This is a story about positioning and presence, about understanding that sometimes saving lives matters more than following doctrine, and about 30 minutes over Germany when one man decided that 300 other men deserved a chance to go home. On January 11th, 1944, high above the frozen farmland near Oschersleben in central Germany, a formation of American B-17 bombers found themselves separated from the main bomber stream. Below them, more than 30 German fighters positioned themselves for the kill, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs circling like wolves that had cornered their prey. The bomber crews knew what was coming. They had seen it before, or heard the stories, the head-on attack, the one tactic that American bombers had no good defense against. Then, from somewhere in the chaos of that winter sky, a single P-51 Mustang appeared. The pilot was First Lieutenant James Howard, 30 years old, flying his 23rd mission over Europe. His wingmen were gone, scattered in combat. His fuel gauge showed he barely had enough gasoline to reach England if he turned back immediately. Every tactical manual said the same thing. One aircraft cannot hold off 30. But Howard did something that violated every principle of fighter escort doctrine. He positioned himself directly in the German fighter's attack path and stayed there for 30 minutes, disrupting every attempt they made to reach the bombers. When he finally landed in England with an empty fuel tank and bullet holes scattered across his aircraft, the bomber crews were already telling a story that would earn Howard the Medal of Honor and force the 8th Air Force to reconsider everything it thought it knew about fighter escort tactics. To understand how one pilot achieved what an entire squadron should have done, we need to go back to the winter of 1943, when American bombers were bleeding crews faster than training schools could replace them. The winter of 1943 was etched into the memory of every American airman in England. Ice-covered runways before dawn. Ground crews worked in darkness, their breath freezing in the air as they prepared aircraft for missions that would begin at first light. Inside Nissen huts, young men lay awake, knowing that morning meant another gamble with survival. The 8th Air Force believed in a theory that looked perfect on paper. B-17, flying fortresses would strike Germany by daylight, flying in tight formations whose overlapping machine gun fire would protect them. Precision bombing, guided by the Norden bomb sight, would destroy factories, oil refineries, and aircraft plants, breaking the enemy's ability to wage war. But reality was far harsher. By late 1943, German fighter pilots had mastered a tactic that shattered American assumptions: the head-on attack. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs charged straight through bomber formations at closing speeds of more than 500 miles per hour. Bomber gunners had only seconds to react, seconds stolen by freezing cold, oxygen masks, vibrating aircraft, and weapons never designed for such encounters. The mathematics of air combat favored the attacker. One clean pass could destroy a bomber. A bomber crew had to survive dozens. Losses climbed relentlessly. Some missions cost one aircraft in 5. Entire squadrons vanished over Germany. Empty bunks appeared in huts. Letters home began with words families feared most. Fighter escorts tried to help, but they could not stay. P-47s and P-38s simply lacked the fuel to follow the bombers deep into the Reich. At a certain point, the fighters turned back, and the bombers flew on alone. The Luftwaffe waited for those moments. Guided by radar and ground controllers, experienced German pilots struck when escorts disappeared, launching head-on attacks that bomber crews came to fear above all others. It was into this unforgiving sky that one pilot arrived, already shaped by a different war on the far side of the world, who had learned how to survive when outnumbered and how to fight when retreat was no longer an option. James Harold Howard did not fit the usual image of an American fighter pilot in 1943. He was quiet where others were loud, analytical where others relied on instinct. At 30 years old, he was older than most of the pilots around him, men barely out of training, still learning what combat truly meant. Howard's path to a P-51 cockpit over Germany had been shaped by a very different war, in a place most Americans barely knew existed. Born in 1913 in Canton, China, Howard grew up between cultures. His parents ran a medical mission, treating and teaching anyone who came to their door. He learned to move easily between Chinese and American worlds, speaking both languages fluently, absorbing early the idea that situations were rarely simple and that understanding required seeing from more than one angle. That habit, of reading beneath the surface, would later define how he fought. Howard returned to the United States for college, studying pre-medicine, but aviation drew him away. In 1937 he joined the U.S. Navy as an aviation cadet, only to be removed from flight training due to a minor medical issue. For most men, that would have ended the dream. Howard went back to China. In 1941, he joined the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, flying obsolete P-40s against Japanese aircraft that were faster and more maneuverable. Under Claire Chennault, Howard learned not to fight fair. The Tigers survived by exploiting altitude, speed, and surprise, diving attacks, single passes, and immediate disengagement. They fought outnumbered, without replacements, spare parts, or safety nets. Howard thrived. In 6 months he was credited with 6 victories, but the greater value lay in what he learned: how to manage energy, how geometry mattered more than bravado, how positioning could decide a fight before a shot was fired. He learned to stay calm while outnumbered, to calculate under pressure, and to treat combat not as chaos, but as a problem to be solved. When the Flying Tigers disbanded, Howard joined the U.S. Army Air Forces. Instead of being sent back to the Pacific, he was assigned to England, to the 354 Fighter Group, flying the new P-51 Mustang. The timing could not have been more critical. The bomber offensive was bleeding losses, and escort fighters were desperately needed. Among younger pilots, Howard stood apart. He studied mission reports instead of boasting. He asked questions about fuel, ammunition, and enemy tactics. He flew deliberately, conserving resources, positioning carefully. He did not rely on luck. He relied on decisions. By early January 1944, Howard had completed 22 missions over Europe. He understood exactly what bomber crews faced, how vulnerable they were, how little margin for error existed once escorts turned back. On his 23rd mission, that understanding would matter more than any number of enemy aircraft destroyed. What followed would earn him recognition not for how many fighters he shot down, but for where he chose to be when it mattered most. The mission briefing on January 11th, 1944, was grimly familiar. The target lay near Oschersleben, deep in central Germany. Aircraft factories and ball-bearing plants vital to the Reich. Intelligence warned of heavy flak and strong fighter opposition. It was a maximum-range mission. The P-51 escorts would have just enough fuel to stay with the bombers briefly, then race home. There would be no margin for error. Howard took off into the frozen darkness before dawn. As daylight crept over England, hundreds of B-17s assembled below him, forming the massive combat boxes that would cross the North Sea together. From above, the formation looked powerful. Howard knew how fragile it truly was. Weather shattered that illusion. Thick cloud cover broke up the bomber stream as aircraft struggled to hold formation while flying blind. Some groups emerged alone, isolated from the protective mass. Radio traffic grew tense. The carefully planned geometry of the mission began to unravel. As the force neared German airspace, Luftwaffe fighters appeared, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs climbing with discipline and patience, guided by radar and ground controllers. The escorts engaged, and the sky dissolved into scattered dogfights. Fuel burned fast. Every turn, every burst of power shortened the distance home. Howard was drawn into combat with FW-190s attacking a bomber group. He broke up one attack, then another. And then, in the chaos of maneuver and pursuit, he leveled out and found himself alone. His wingmen were gone. The radio answered with static. Then he saw them. About 30 B-17s drifting west, separated from the main formation. No escorts. Below them, more than 30 German fighters circled calmly, organizing for a coordinated attack. The Germans were not rushing. They were preparing to kill. Howard checked his fuel. He was already below safe margins. Turning back now would give him a chance to reach England. Fighting would almost certainly eliminate that chance. Doctrine was clear. Disengage. Outnumbered. Low fuel. Alone. But 30 bombers meant hundreds of men. Howard understood something the manuals could not teach. That presence could matter more than numbers. That disrupting an attack could be as decisive as destroying aircraft. He had learned that lesson years earlier, fighting outnumbered in the skies over China. He made his decision. Howard pushed the throttle forward and dove. As the first German fighters committed to their attack, his Mustang came screaming down from above. He fired, tearing into a Messerschmitt and forcing it to break away, trailing smoke. The others scattered, suddenly confronted by resistance where they had expected helpless bombers. Confusion spread through the German formation. One fighter should not have mattered, but Howard placed himself directly in their path, forcing them to react to him before they could reach the bombers. They regrouped and attacked again. Howard met them head-on, then did something no escort doctrine had prepared for. He flew forward of the bombers, placing himself between the attackers and the formation. He was no longer escorting from the side, he was standing in the way. Fighter escort doctrine in 1944 was explicit and unambiguous about positioning. Escort stayed outside bomber formations, patrolling the flanks, flying high cover above and behind, positioning themselves along the approach vectors where enemy fighters were most likely to appear. The goal was to intercept threats before they reached the bombers, to create a protective bubble around the vulnerable heavy aircraft, to engage enemy fighters at a distance where their attacks could be disrupted before they became dangerous. No one flew inside the bomber formation. The risks were too high and too obvious. Bombers flew wingtip to wingtip with minimal spacing. Their pilots focused on maintaining position while managing aircraft that were heavy, sluggish at altitude, and difficult to maneuver. The turbulence created by dozens of large aircraft flying in close proximity created invisible walls of disturbed air. Prop wash, wing vortices, sudden downdrafts and updrafts that could throw a fighter out of control or slam it into a bomber. And there was another risk that made close positioning almost suicidal. The bomber gunners themselves. They were trained to fire at anything that moved within range. Friend or foe, if it was close and fast, they shot first and identified it later. The gunners were nervous, often exhausted, always afraid, operating machine guns while wearing oxygen masks in temperatures well below zero, watching for threats that could come from any direction at any moment. Trigger discipline was difficult to maintain when you knew that hesitating for even a second could mean the difference between shooting down an attacker and watching your aircraft explode. The chance of being hit by friendly fire from a nervous gunner who mistook your fighter for an enemy aircraft was high enough that smart pilots stayed well clear of the bombers they were protecting. But Howard appears to have understood something the doctrine may have missed, something that his experience with the Flying Tigers had taught him about asymmetric warfare and unconventional tactics. The German tactic worked because nothing interfered with pilots lining up their attacks and committing fully to high-speed runs through the formations. The psychological advantage belonged entirely to the attacker. German pilots could position themselves, could take their time setting up the geometry, could commit to their runs knowing that the bombers had no good defense against the head-on pass. Howard decided to become that interference, to introduce the one variable the Germans had not planned for. He throttled back to match the bomber's speed, perhaps 180 miles per hour, cruising speed for a B-17 formation at altitude, and positioned his Mustang just ahead and slightly below the lead B-17. The transition from combat speed to formation speed would have required precise throttle control, careful attention to airspeed, constant adjustments to maintain position. The bomber crews could see him now, close enough that they could make out the markings on his aircraft, close enough that gunners in the nose turrets might have been tracking him with their weapons, fingers near triggers, waiting to see what he would do. What they thought in those moments is difficult to know with certainty. Some might have assumed he was damaged, his aircraft crippled by combat, trying to stay close to the formation for protection or guidance. Others may have begun to realize he was deliberately placing himself in the most dangerous position in the entire combat area, that he was positioning himself as a human shield between them and the German fighters below. The German fighters came again, and this time Howard's positioning revealed its tactical logic. 2 Messerschmitts diving from 11 o'clock high, perfectly positioned for a textbook head-on pass. Their angle was correct, their spacing was good, their closure rate was exactly what it should be. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a successful attack. The German fighters would have poured cannon and machine gun fire into the lead bombers, crippling or destroying them, then flashed through the formation and climbed away before the defensive gunners could respond effectively. But Howard was there, his Mustang silhouetted against the sky directly in the Germans' attack path. He held position until the German fighters were committed to their dive, until they were close enough that breaking off would cost them critical seconds of repositioning and all the energy they had built up in the dive. Then he fired a short burst, probably only a second or two, just enough rounds to show the Germans that he was armed and willing to engage, and broke left, his Mustang flashing across the Germans' line of sight. The lead Messerschmitt flinched, rolled hard, pulled out of the dive. The second fighter followed, neither pilot willing to press the attack. The risk calculation had changed in an instant. Continuing the run meant a head-on engagement with an armed opponent at a combined closing speed that probably exceeded 600 miles per hour. At that speed, even a brief exchange of fire could be lethal to both aircraft. The slightest miscalculation in spacing could result in collision, and collision at 600 miles per hour meant death for everyone involved. The Germans were skilled pilots, experienced and aggressive, but they were not suicidal. They broke off. Howard climbed, rolled, and returned to his position just ahead of the lead bomber. The B-17 pilots adjusted their formation slightly, tightening up, perhaps beginning to understand what he was doing. He was not just defending them in the conventional sense, he was making himself a physical obstacle that the Germans had to overcome before they could reach their targets. The Luftwaffe pilots regrouped, they were persistent and professional, and they recognized that one American fighter, however well positioned, should not be able to stop an entire staffel from completing its mission. They tried beam attacks, coming in from the side where bomber formations were theoretically more vulnerable, where the concentration of defensive fire was less intense than from the front or rear. Howard met them at an angle, positioning his Mustang to disrupt their attack geometry, firing short bursts that forced them to adjust their runs. The disruption was enough. Attacks that should have been pressed home to point-blank range were broken off early, German pilots unwilling to accept the risk of engaging a maneuvering fighter while trying to line up on bombers. They tried vertical dives from above, hoping to come down through the formation too fast for Howard to intercept. He climbed to meet them, forcing them to overshoot, using the Mustang's excellent climb rate and energy retention to position himself where he could contest even vertical attacks. They attempted coordinated runs from multiple angles, the kind of sophisticated assault that required good communication and timing, multiple fighters hitting the formation simultaneously from different directions to split the defensive response and overwhelm individual positions. Howard pivoted between threats, gave each group of attackers enough resistance that they had to make a choice: break off the run or accept engagement with a fighter while ignoring the bombers. Most chose to break off. The tactical mathematics had shifted. Each German pilot had to calculate whether pressing the attack on a bomber was worth the risk of being engaged by Howard's Mustang, whether the potential kill was worth the possibility of being killed themselves. Official records credit Howard with shooting down 3 German aircraft during this engagement. The exact circumstances of those kills have not been preserved in detail. Combat reports from that era were often brief, focusing on results rather than detailed narrative. But each aircraft he destroyed likely sent a signal to the other German pilots that this American was dangerous and unpredictable, that engaging him carried real risk. The uncertainty he created may have been as valuable as the aircraft eliminated, because it made every German pilot think twice before committing to an attack run. The combat continued for approximately 30 minutes, an eternity in aerial warfare, where most engagements last only a few minutes before fuel or ammunition or tactical position forces someone to disengage. Resources depleted with every passing moment. Ammunition counters on Howard's gun sight would have been dropping steadily, each burst consuming rounds that could not be replaced until he landed. Engine temperature gauges might have been creeping higher from sustained high power settings, the Merlin engine working hard to provide the performance Howard demanded. His aircraft took hits, rounds that punched through the fuselage and missed critical systems by what ground crews would later determine were inches, perhaps feet. The margin between survival and death at that altitude, at those speeds, was measured in very small units. Something else appears to have emerged during those minutes, something that no training manual had covered and no tactical doctrine had anticipated. The bomber gunners began working with Howard, coordinating their defensive fire with his maneuvers in an improvised partnership that developed organically in response to the tactical situation. They may have held their fire when he maneuvered close to the formation, giving him space to operate without risk of being hit by friendly fire. They possibly called out threats over the radio, German fighters positioning for attacks that Howard might not be able to see from his position, warnings about altitude and direction and distance that helped him anticipate where the next threat would come from. They perhaps covered angles he could not immediately address, their .50 caliber machine guns tracking threats that approached from sectors Howard could not defend alone. An unplanned coordination developed between one fighter pilot and 30 bomber crews, hundreds of men who had never trained together, who did not know each other's names, who were improvising a defensive system in real time because survival demanded it. They were working together against an enemy that outnumbered them all, adapting to a situation that none of them had prepared for, proving that sometimes necessity creates innovations that peacetime planning never anticipates. The German fighters remained engaged, still attacking, still trying to break through Howard's defense and reach the bombers. But every pass Howard contested burned their fuel and consumed their ammunition. Every failed attack may have taken a psychological toll, the accumulated frustration of being unable to execute a tactic they had used successfully many times before, the growing recognition that this engagement was costing them more than it was worth, that the American formations were approaching the zone where other Allied fighters would return to provide escort for the homeward journey. When Howard's fuel reached the point where continuing meant not reaching England, when the mathematics became absolute and the choice was no longer whether to stay or go, but whether he would have enough gasoline to cross the channel, the Germans broke off their attacks. They were approaching the edge of the target zone, the invisible line where American escorts typically reappeared, where the tactical calculation shifted from favorable to unfavorable. The window of opportunity had closed. The German fighters departed in pairs, diving toward lower altitudes, disappearing into the clouds below. Howard did not chase. He had no fuel for pursuit, minimal ammunition remaining, barely enough airspeed to keep his aircraft flying level. He eased his Mustang out of the bomber formation with control inputs that preserved every foot of altitude, every knot of speed, every advantage he could maintain for the long flight home. The lead B-17 wagged its wings, a simple gesture, a movement of the control surfaces that required almost no effort but carried enormous meaning. It was acknowledgement in the only language available at 20,000 feet when radios fail and words are impossible. It meant, "We see you. We understand what you did. We know you saved our lives." Howard returned the gesture, a small movement of his own wings that cost him almost nothing in energy, but conveyed everything that needed to be said between combat airmen who understood the mathematics of survival. Then he rolled level, pointed his nose toward the distant English coast, and began the longest flight of his life. The P-51's Merlin engine coughed once, then again, the unmistakable sound of fuel starvation, of an engine that has consumed everything available and is beginning to draw air instead of gasoline. Howard's hand moved to the fuel mixture control, adjusting it with the kind of precision that comes from hundreds of hours in the cockpit, leaning the mixture as far as he dared without risking engine failure entirely. He was flying on mathematics now, calculating every mile against the fuel remaining, hoping the winds would cooperate, hoping he had not made an error in navigation that would add distance to the journey home. The Merlin smoothed out temporarily, the mixture adjustment giving him a few more minutes of power, but the fuel gauge showed empty, or very close to it. The reserve tank, designed to give pilots enough fuel to reach a friendly airfield in emergencies, was all that remained. How long that would last depended on too many variables: altitude, airspeed, engine settings, whether the gauge was accurate or whether it read optimistically. Fighter pilots learned not to trust fuel gauges completely. The gauges could stick, could read wrong, could fail to account for fuel sloshing in tanks during combat maneuvers. Howard flew as efficiently as he could, maintaining altitude where the air was thinner and the engine more efficient, choosing a power setting that balanced fuel consumption against the need to keep moving toward England. Every decision involved trade-offs. Flying higher meant better fuel economy, but risked running out of oxygen if his oxygen system failed. Flying lower meant thicker air and worse fuel consumption, but would allow him to bail out with some chance of survival if the engine quit. He chose to stay high, betting that the engine would keep running long enough to get him across the channel. The English coast appeared through winter haze, grey cliffs against grey water, the most beautiful sight any combat pilot could imagine. But Howard was not safe yet. He was at 2,000 feet, too low for comfort if something went wrong, too high to bail out safely if the engine quit entirely. At 2,000 feet, you have perhaps 30 seconds from engine failure to ground impact. 30 seconds to make the decision whether to try to glide to a landing or bail out and hope the parachute has time to deploy fully. Most pilots who bailed out below 3,000 feet did not survive. He spotted an airfield, not his home base, but any runway that was long enough and friendly. The Mustang was designed to operate from relatively short runways, but landing with minimal fuel meant the aircraft would be light, which meant it would float during the landing flare, which meant he would need more runway than normal to get the aircraft stopped. He lined up on final approach, lowered his landing gear and flaps, felt the aircraft slow and settle into landing configuration. The Mustang touched down, main wheels first, then the tail wheels settling onto the runway. Howard let it roll, applying brakes gently to avoid skidding on what might be icy pavement. The aircraft slowed, rolled to a stop on the taxiway. The engine coughed one final time and died, not from damage, but simply because there was nothing left in the tanks to burn. The propeller windmilled to a stop in the slipstream. Ground crews ran toward the aircraft, probably expecting to find a pilot wounded or an aircraft damaged, some explanation for why he had landed at an emergency field away from his home base. What they found was bullet holes, scattered across the wings like random punctuation marks, clustered in the tail section where German fighters had tried to hit him from behind, a few in the fuselage that had punched through aluminum skin and missed hydraulic lines and control cables by margins measured in inches. They found an engine that had been running on fuel reserves that should not have existed, that had consumed every drop of gasoline the aircraft could carry, and then somehow found a few more drops to get the pilot home. They found a pilot who appeared calm, almost detached, climbing out of the cockpit with the kind of deliberate movements that suggested fatigue, but not injury. Howard's flight suit would have been soaked with sweat despite the cold. Combat does that. Adrenaline and physical effort and the stress of life or death decisions creating heat that cold altitude cannot dissipate. His oxygen mask would have left marks on his face where it pressed against skin for hours. His hands might have been shaking slightly from the physical effort of controlling the aircraft through violent maneuvers, from the adrenaline that your body produces during combat, and that takes hours to metabolize fully. Howard filed a brief combat report with the intelligence officers who debriefed returning pilots. The reports from that era followed a standard format: date, time, location, enemy aircraft encountered, friendly aircraft lost, results. Howard mentioned the bombers he had found separated from the main formation. He mentioned the German fighters positioning for attack. He described the positioning he had used, the attacks he had contested, the aircraft he believed he had destroyed. He did not embellish, did not claim certainty about details that were unclear in the chaos of combat. He simply described what had happened, the way a mechanic might describe how an engine works, factually without drama, focused on the essential information. The bomber crews told a different story, or rather, they told the same story but with different emphasis, with the perspective of men who had been on the receiving end of Howard's decision to stay and fight. When the B-17s landed at their bases scattered across England, their crews climbed out and went immediately to debriefings. Intelligence officers sat with notebooks open, recording what the crews said, building the operational picture of what had happened on the mission, noting which targets had been hit, which formations had encountered heavy opposition, which aircraft had been lost. The testimonies from the crews of those 30 isolated bombers were remarkably consistent, more consistent than intelligence officers typically saw when multiple crews described the same combat. They described a lone P-51 Mustang that had appeared when they were isolated and under attack, when German fighters were positioning for runs that would almost certainly have destroyed several bombers and damaged many more. They described a pilot who had stayed with them for what seemed like extended time. The actual duration was probably around 30 minutes. Though time perception in combat is notoriously unreliable, minutes can feel like hours when you are watching enemy fighters position to kill you. They described watching that single American aircraft position itself ahead of their formation, watching it engage German fighters again and again, watching it somehow disrupt attack after attack, despite being outnumbered by factors that should have made defense impossible. The bomber crews were experienced enough to understand how unusual this was, how far outside normal escort doctrine Howard had operated, how much risk he had accepted to protect aircraft he had never seen before, flown by men whose names he did not know. Gunners estimated at least 14 separate enemy aircraft engaged by that lone Mustang, though the exact number of German fighters in the area remains uncertain from historical records. Different crews saw different parts of the battle, and combat is chaotic enough that accurate counts are difficult even when you are not also trying to survive. What mattered was not the precise number, but the fact that every crew member who survived agreed on one essential fact. Without that pilot, without that lone Mustang that stayed when every tactical manual said to leave, they would not have returned home. Word spread through 8th Air Force bomber bases with the kind of speed that only word of mouth can achieve. Crews told other crews. Ground crew members heard the stories while servicing returning aircraft. Intelligence officers compared notes across different bases, assembling the operational picture. Within days, someone made the connection. That single P-51 the bomber crews described matched a pilot who had landed at an emergency field with an empty fuel tank and bullet holes scattered across his aircraft. Someone cross-referenced Howard's brief combat report with the detailed testimonies from bomber crews, and people began to understand that something extraordinary had happened. Commanders reviewed Howard's report, cross-referenced it with bomber crew testimonies, studied the tactical implications of what had occurred. What Howard had done violated standard operating procedure. It was reckless by conventional measure, dangerous to the point of being nearly suicidal, the kind of improvisation that should not work and probably should not be attempted. Fighter pilots were valuable, difficult, and expensive to train, important to the overall campaign. Risking a fighter pilot in a situation with such low probability of success, where the most likely outcome was the loss of both the pilot and his aircraft, was exactly the kind of decision that military doctrine was designed to prevent. But it had worked. In a campaign where bomber losses were crippling morale and threatening the viability of the entire daylight bombing offensive, where every mission produced casualty rates that would have been unsustainable in any extended campaign, Howard had demonstrated that sometimes the conventional wisdom was wrong. Sometimes one pilot in the right position could achieve results that an entire squadron in conventional positions could not. Sometimes the willingness to accept personal risk could save lives that orthodox tactics would have left to die. On June 6, 1944, coinciding with the Normandy landings that would forever be remembered as D-Day, James H. Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, personally presented the decoration in a ceremony in England. The timing was symbolic, perhaps coincidental, perhaps deliberately chosen to emphasize that the invasion of Europe depended on air superiority, and air superiority had been won partly through the kind of tactical innovation and personal courage that Howard had demonstrated over Oschersleben. He was the only fighter pilot in the European theater of operations to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II. The distinction was significant. Many pilots flew with extraordinary courage. Many achieved higher kill counts. There were aces with 20, 30, 40 victories. Many performed acts of great valor, protecting bombers, engaging superior numbers of enemy fighters, completing missions under conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. But Howard's mission on January 11, 1944, represented something different. Not just individual heroism, but a tactical innovation that changed how the 8th Air Force understood fighter escort. The official citation praised Howard's conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. The language was formal, the phrasing standard for Medal of Honor citations, but the citation could not fully capture what mattered most about Howard's achievement. He had not fought from blind heroism, from reckless disregard for personal safety, from the kind of impulsive courage that leads men to charge machine gun nests or hold positions against impossible odds simply because they cannot accept the alternative. Howard had fought from understanding, a deep, intuitive grasp of how air combat worked, of what the enemy needed to succeed, of how presence and positioning could disrupt that success even when firepower was insufficient to destroy every threat. He had calculated the odds, understood the risks, and made a conscious decision that the lives of hundreds of bomber crew members were worth those risks. That kind of courage, the courage that comes from understanding exactly how bad the situation is and choosing to act anyway, is qualitatively different from the courage that comes from not fully comprehending the danger. Traditional fighter escort doctrine had been built on reasonable assumptions, developed by smart people who understood air combat and who had thought carefully about how to protect bombers. Fighters should stay outside bomber formations to avoid the risks of collision, turbulence, and friendly fire. They should position themselves to intercept enemy fighters before those fighters reached the bombers, maintaining a protective bubble that would catch threats at a distance where they could be neutralized. The doctrine emphasized offensive action, going out to find the enemy rather than waiting for the enemy to come to you, maintaining the initiative, keeping enemy fighters away from the bombers through aggressive patrol and interception. Howard's mission may have revealed a flaw in these assumptions, or perhaps more accurately, a gap in the tactical toolkit that the doctrine provided. The German head-on attack succeeded because it was fast, and because it exploited the bomber's weakest defensive capability. By the time German fighters committed to their attack runs, conventional escort positioning made interception difficult. The geometry of the situation favored the attacker. Fighters positioned at high altitude or on the flanks of the bomber formation had to dive and accelerate to intercept head-on attackers, had to calculate lead angles while traveling at high speed, had to close the distance before the German fighters reached the bombers. It was possible sometimes, but it was difficult, and it often failed. Howard had demonstrated an alternative approach. By placing himself as a physical obstacle in the Germans' line of attack, by positioning himself where his mere presence forced enemy pilots to make difficult decisions, he had turned disruption into a weapon more effective than pure firepower. He did not need to shoot down every attacking fighter. He only needed to make each attack more difficult, more uncertain, more costly in terms of risk and timing. The psychological impact of having to engage a defending fighter while simultaneously trying to line up on bombers was enough to cause many German pilots to break off attacks they might otherwise have pressed home. The tactical mathematics were compelling. One fighter optimally positioned could have greater effect than multiple fighters in conventional positions. Disruption mattered more than destruction. The goal was not necessarily to kill enemy fighters, but to prevent them from killing bombers. Those were related objectives but not identical, and the distinction mattered. In the weeks and months following Howard's mission, the 8th Air Force appears to have modified its escort tactics, though documenting the exact influence of any single mission on the evolution of doctrine is difficult. Warfare is complex, with multiple factors influencing outcomes, and tactical evolution happens gradually as lessons from many missions accumulate and commanders adjust procedures based on aggregated experience. But fighter groups began receiving guidance that emphasized closer positioning to bomber formations, particularly during critical mission phases when German interception was most likely. Escorts were encouraged to position themselves more aggressively along probable attack vectors, to stay nearer to the bombers rather than ranging far afield in search of targets of opportunity. Whether Howard's mission directly caused these changes or coincided with evolution that was already underway is difficult to determine with certainty. The historical record shows correlation, but establishing causation requires evidence that is not always available 70 years after the events. What is clear is that bomber crews noticed changes in how fighters escorted them on missions after early 1944. They reported feeling safer, reported that escorts seemed to stay closer and engage threats more quickly. The perception of increased protection mattered almost as much as the reality. Crews who felt protected flew with more confidence, maintained formation discipline better, completed missions with less psychological strain. German intelligence reports from captured Luftwaffe pilots, analyzed after the war, referenced American fighters that refused to leave the bombers, and that made coordinated attacks significantly more difficult than they had been in 1943. The head-on attack remained in use throughout the war. It was too effective to abandon entirely, and German pilots continued to achieve successes with it when they could execute it properly. But its success rate appears to have declined as American escorts positioned themselves more aggressively, as tactics evolved to counter the tactic, as the Luftwaffe lost experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements. Howard returned to combat after receiving his Medal of Honor. He flew additional missions as the Allied bombing campaign intensified through the spring and summer of 1944, as American fighters achieved air superiority over Germany, as the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies gradually diminished under the weight of numerical and material superiority. He engaged German fighters when they appeared, trained newer pilots in the lessons he had learned from 2 years of combat in 2 different theaters, shared what he understood about positioning and awareness and fuel management and ammunition conservation. His final tally was 6 aerial victories in the European theater, in addition to the 6 he had achieved with the Flying Tigers in China and Burma, 12 confirmed kills total over the course of the war. It was a respectable number, reflecting skill and experience, but modest compared to the high-scoring aces who accumulated 20 or 30 or more victories. Some pilots in the European theater exceeded 40 kills. The top American ace in Europe, Francis Gabreski, was credited with 28 aerial victories. But aerial victories were never the measure of Howard's impact on the air war. He had demonstrated that tactical innovation mattered as much as individual skill, that understanding combat geometry could multiply effectiveness beyond what raw performance or pure courage could achieve, that sometimes the willingness to think differently, to act outside the boundaries of established doctrine, could produce results that conventional approaches could not match. He had shown that courage combined with calculation could achieve outcomes that courage alone could not, that the most effective warriors were not necessarily those who took the most risks, but those who took the right risks at the right moments for the right reasons. After June 1944, James Howard continued serving with the same quiet competence that had characterized his entire military career. He flew additional missions as the Allied bombing campaign intensified in preparation for and support of the Normandy invasion and the subsequent drive across France toward Germany. He watched American fighters achieve air superiority over Europe, observed the gradual decline of the Luftwaffe's effectiveness as experienced German pilots were killed or captured and replaced by younger pilots with less training and fewer resources. The nature of air combat over Europe changed dramatically in the latter part of 1944. The introduction of long-range P-51 escorts in sufficient numbers meant that bombers could be protected throughout their missions, not just part-way. The Allied invasion of France provided emergency landing fields closer to Germany, reducing the consequences of battle damage or mechanical problems. German fuel shortages limited training hours for new pilots and sometimes grounded entire fighter units. The tide of the air war had turned decisively in favor of the Allies, though German fighters remained dangerous when they could get airborne and when they were flown by the remaining experienced pilots. Howard trained new pilots, sharing lessons from China and Europe, trying to give young men the tools they needed for survival in an environment where mistakes were usually fatal. Teaching combat flying is difficult because so much of it depends on split-second decisions made under conditions of extreme stress, where the difference between life and death can be measured in fractions of a second or degrees of angle. But Howard tried, discussing positioning and awareness, fuel management and ammunition conservation, the importance of staying calm when chaos ruled the sky around you. Some of the pilots he trained survived the war. Some did not. That is the nature of combat, and Howard understood it as well as anyone who has fought in multiple wars. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally, its cities in ruins, its military shattered, its leadership either dead or awaiting trial. Howard survived, alive, uninjured beyond the normal wear that combat places on human bodies and minds, able to return home, able to begin the difficult transition from wartime service to peacetime life that every combat veteran faces. He remained in the Air Force rather than returning to civilian life. The decision may have been practical. He had spent years in military service, and the Air Force offered stable employment and a clear career path. Or it may have been that military service had become his identity, that he no longer fit easily into civilian society, that the skills he had developed were more valuable in uniform than out of it. Many combat veterans face this choice, and there is no single answer that works for everyone. He rose through the ranks over the following years, eventually achieving the rank of Brigadier General. He commanded units, served in staff positions, contributed to the development of air power doctrine in the early Cold War period, when the jet age was transforming everything about military aviation. The lessons of World War II about positioning and tactics and the importance of innovation remained relevant even as the technology changed from propeller-driven fighters to jets that flew at speeds that would have been unimaginable in 1944. He retired in 1966 after nearly 30 years of service, having served in World War II through the Cold War tensions of the 1950s and early 1960s, through the early years of American involvement in Vietnam. He settled in Florida, far from the English airfields where he had flown combat missions, far from the frozen skies over Germany where he had made the decision that would define his place in history. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, deflected attempts to make him into a celebrity or public figure, maintained the same quiet privacy that had characterized him during the war. When people asked about the mission on January 11th, 1944, and people did ask, particularly veterans groups and aviation historians who recognized the significance of what he had achieved, Howard's responses were characteristically understated. While no direct quotes from Howard about the mission have been widely preserved in historical records, accounts from those who knew him suggest he may have described it as doing what the situation required, not heroism but problem-solving, seeing bombers in danger, assessing the tactical situation, identifying a gap in the defenses, and filling it. He might have said that the decision was obvious once you understood the geometry, that any pilot with his experience would have done the same thing, that he happened to be in the right place, at the right time. That kind of modesty was common among combat veterans of his generation, men who had done extraordinary things, but who understood that war was too complex and too terrible to reduce to simple stories of individual heroism. But the bomber crews who flew in those approximately 30 B-17s on January 11, 1944, carried a different understanding. Some of them spent decades telling the story of the lone Mustang that had saved their lives. They told the story to their children and grandchildren, shared it at veterans' reunions, made sure that anyone who would listen understood what one pilot had done for them on a frozen January day over Germany. They gathered at reunions and remembered that day, remembered the fear of being separated from the main formation, remembered watching German fighters position below them, remembered the relief of seeing a single American fighter appear and stay when every rational calculation said he should leave. According to accounts that circulated in veteran communities, some of them named their sons James in honor of the pilot whose actions had given them the chance to come home and have families. Whether that is literally true or part of the mythology that grows up around remarkable events is difficult to verify, but the sentiment behind it is clear. Letters may have arrived at Howard's home over the years from men who had been in those bombers, thanking him for giving them the chance to grow old, to see their children graduate from college, to watch grandchildren being born, to live lives that would have been cut short if not for his decision to stay and fight. Such letters were probably difficult to read because they reminded him that hundreds of lives had hung on decisions he made in those 30 minutes, because they reminded him of other missions where pilots and crews were not as fortunate, because they forced him to think about the weight of responsibility that combat places on those who survive. James Howard died in 1995 at age 81. His funeral was attended by veterans, fellow pilots, and men who had flown in bombers over Europe 50 years earlier. They came to pay respects to a man who had saved their lives, to honor someone who had demonstrated what one person could achieve when courage and calculation and tactical understanding combined at the critical moment. They did not speak primarily about tactics or doctrine or the technical details of aerial combat. They spoke about the day a lone Mustang had stayed when every logical reason said to leave, when every tactical calculation suggested the situation was hopeless, when standard procedure demanded disengagement and self-preservation. They spoke about a pilot who had somehow held the line when the line should not have held, who had protected hundreds of men through nothing more than positioning and presence, and the refusal to accept that the impossible was truly impossible. They spoke about courage, not the kind that comes from not understanding the danger, but the courage to act when you fully understand how bad the odds are, when you have calculated the risks and decided that some things matter more than personal survival. They spoke about bomber crews who returned home because one pilot decided their survival was worth the risk of his own life. The lesson James Howard left was not a tactic that could be taught in flight school or codified in a training manual. It was a principle that the most powerful weapon in war is not the machine, but the mind that dares to use it differently. That creativity and calculation and courage, combined in the right proportions at the right moment, can achieve results that firepower alone cannot. That one person in one moment, positioned correctly and acting decisively, can tip the balance even when the mathematics suggest otherwise. In the vast library of World War II history, James Howard's name appears less frequently than perhaps it should. He was not flashy, did not accumulate the kind of statistics that make headlines, did not fit the stereotype of the swaggering fighter ace. His story lacks some of the dramatic elements that popular history prefers. He did not shoot down dozens of enemy aircraft, did not perform physically impossible aerobatic maneuvers, did not give speeches full of quotable lines about duty and honor and sacrifice. But the men who flew in those approximately 30 B-17 bombers on January 11, 1944, knew what he had accomplished. They understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary, that they had been saved by tactical innovation and personal courage operating in perfect combination. They carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives, and they made sure their families knew the story, made sure that the next generation understood what one pilot had done on a frozen winter day over Germany. James Howard held the line because the line needed holding. He flew into impossible odds because 300 lives hung in the balance. He demonstrated that some equations are worth solving even when the numbers say you cannot win, that some decisions are worth making even when every tactical manual says to do otherwise. And he earned a place in history that no citation or medal could fully capture. The quiet respect of 300 men who lived to grow old, who watched their children grow up, who experienced all the moments of life that would have been denied them if one pilot had made the safe decision instead of the right one. His legacy is not measured in aerial victories or in the tactical innovations that may have followed from his example. His legacy is measured in the lives he saved, in the families that existed because bomber crews made it home on January 11, 1944, in the principle he demonstrated that sometimes one person in one moment can change everything. If this story of courage and tactical brilliance moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history's greatest battles. Every week, we bring you the human stories behind the tactics, the individuals who changed the course of war, and the lessons that still matter today. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story worth remembering.